The 1995 Intel World Chess Championship took place at the top of the world, as New Yorkers like to call the observation deck of the World Trade Center. The players would contest the match in a specially constructed soundproof booth, a goldfish bowl for the world's media to gawp into. Although Garry Kasparov had been at the top of the chess world for 10 years, many people felt that his time had come. At 32, he no longer looked invincible. The years of pressure and tension were taking their toll. His challenger was Viswanathan Anand from India. At 25, Vishy looked young, fit and motivated. With his fast and fluent style, he'd cut a swathe through the world's best players to reach this final. On the other hand, Kasparov's last tough World Championship match had been 5 years ago against Karpov. His match in 1993 against Short hadn't really stretched him, so no one could predict how he was going to play here. Earlier this year, the players met in the Kremlin in the first leg of the Intel Grand Prix, where Anand slaughtered Kasparov at speed chess.
And Kasparov has resigned. Oh, what a powerful performance by Anand. Totally outplaying an esteemed opponent. A very impressive victory. Kasparov must be disgusted.
But would the world's fastest player be crowned the world's best player?
He's a good player, and I have to admit that this player is much more solid and more stable than Nigel Short in 1993. And I think it will be a very, very, very tough challenge.
Kasparov repeated the dragon variation for game 13. Now, some people felt this was a bit of a risk because Anand had had the weekend to prepare, but remember, Kasparov had had months to prepare the dragon variation. Anand played pretty much the same stuff as in game 11, but at this point he varied. Instead of castling on the queen side, he played a really unusual move. He played knight takes knight on c6, and Kasparov recaptured with the pawn. Now this changes the nature of the position because normally black plays down the c file in the dragon, but here he has an open b file. Anand continued by playing bishop to h6, exchanging off that potentially lethal bishop on g7. Kasparov begun his queenside counterplay with pawn to c5, so the threat is to push on. So Anand played bishop to c4. Now it was strange that at this point Anand was consuming a lot of time. This was rather strange, as Kasparov has been playing very normal moves, and one would have thought that this had all been part of Anand's preparation. It looked very much as though the Indian was losing his self-confidence. Kasparov played the queen to b6, attacking the pawn on b2. Then came bishop takes bishop and king takes bishop. And here Anand played the pawn to b3, which is okay, but I think it's much stronger if white castles on the queen side. And then the idea is to try and break in the centre with moves like queen to e3 and e5. This is a reasonable way for white to play the position, and chances are roughly balanced. b3 would be reasonable if it weren't for Kasparov's next move. He played the dynamic bishop to e6. This is excellent because if bishop takes bishop, then pawn takes bishop, and black is ready to play c4, which breaks open the position. Suddenly black has tremendous counterplay on the c file, and it also opens up the diagonal of black's queen. And black's king is absolutely safe on the king side. Anand had to block this bishop. He played the knight into d5. Kasparov captured, bishop takes d5, then pawn takes bishop, and now a great move. Pawn to e5. The pawn on e7 could potentially be a weakness. It's backward. White might be able to build up pressure. But after e5, the pawn is very strong, and I think psychologically this is difficult for white. Probably white's best here is to castle on the queen side and just to make the best of it. It might not be too bad for white, this position. Instead, Anand captured the pawn on e5. Pawn takes pawn en passant. But this turned out to be a fatal mistake. Kasparov gave a great frown after this move and banged out d5 almost instantly. The pawn can't be captured if bishop takes pawn. Then comes rook f d8, attacking the bishop, and after c4, then pawn takes pawn on e6, and white loses the piece. Therefore, the bishop must retreat to e2. Now, Anand had obviously calculated such moves as queen takes pawn, and then white castles, and this is okay for white. But instead, there came pawn to c4, a great move, opening up the diagonal of the queen on b6 down to g1. Now that means that white cannot castle. The king is stuck in the centre. Castling queenside looks unappetizing because black simply takes the pawn on b3. Pawn takes pawn and then queen takes b3. Anand had obviously completely overlooked this simple pawn sacrifice. If he captures on f7, then this only helps black, because after rook takes pawn, black is ready to double rooks on the e-file. He tried to block the queen out by playing the pawn up to c3 with the idea queen to d4. But Kasparov just built up his attack. He played rook c to e8, a great move. For if white plays the queen to d4, blocking out black's queen, then queen takes pawn on e6, threatening queen takes bishop mate, which forces white back onto the defensive with queen to d2. And remember, white still can't castle here because of the queen and the rook bearing down on the bishop on e2. With his king caught in the middle, white's position is already hopeless. Anand grabbed a pawn on c4, but this already looked like desperation. Then came rook takes pawn on e6, and now capturing another pawn on d5 doesn't really help matters. Simply rook e5, and black is still ready to double rooks. Anand brought his king out of the pin with king f1, but this is really ugly. It means that he's never going to be able to connect his rooks. Then came rook fe8, threatening the bishop, bishop d3. Now Kasparov thought for about 12 minutes in this position. He found pawn takes pawn on c4, and after bishop takes c4, the crushing move, knight e4. Brilliant stuff. The queen on d2 is threatened, as well as knight g3 checkmate. If the knight is captured, then black wins very simply by playing rook f6 check, king e1, rook takes pawn on e4 check. Now if the bishop retreats to e2, then queen f2 check, king d1, and rook takes bishop on e2. And if queen takes rook, rook d6 check, and black wins the queen. Instead of bishop e2, white can play the king to d1, but then simply rook takes bishop on c4, and there's no defence to black's attack. For instance, rook d6 is threatened, and if the king moves to c2, then rook f2 wins the queen anyway. Instead of capturing the knight, white could play the queen back to e1, preventing knight g3 mate, but then comes a simple little move, rook to d6, threatening knight d2 check, and if pawn takes knight, then rook f6 check, king e2, rook takes e4, wins the queen, wins everything. Kasparov enjoyed making that move, knight to e4. He screwed the piece into the board, and Anand had had enough. He resigned.
Definitely now, if I'm not collapsing, I don't see any player among the youngsters that are now just all potential challengers that could challenge me with clear chances of winning. Because this match was also a very important lesson, and I believe the next challenge will take differently, and I will not be caught in such trouble that I was in the beginning of this match. If I want to go, if I want to play, as I said, I have enough energy, enough motivation, and enough chess stamina to carry on my title until the end of the century. Sorry, I made a mistake. I should say end of millennium.